makes you wonder bigger things. For example, how many other dangerous, potentially world-altering experiments are going on right now in this and other countries, funded by the secretive daisy chain of government health agencies and powerful NGOs? Experiments you've never heard of, but that could change your life forever. If they can engineer bat viruses to make them more infectious and whoops, they escape from the lab, what else are they doing? You're not supposed to ask that question. You've been commanded to trust the science and get back to watching Netflix, plebe. Only Neanderthals ask questions. And honestly, that has been the arrangement in science for quite a while now. You pay for it, we do it, it's all good. But why should that continue? Now that we know that liars and moral pygmies, people like Tony Fauci and the soulless bots at Google HQ, are running global science, maybe it's worth being slightly more inquisitive about what's happening in labs around the world. Why not? It could affect us. For example, take a look at this tape. It's from an annual conference called the World Science Festival. A few years ago, the conference featured a professor of bioethics and philosophy at New York University called Matthew Lau. Lau is among the most influential bioethicists in the world, and that's a fact that will amaze you once you see this tape. Here's Lau explaining that climate change can be solved with something called human engineering.
My view is that what we need is a really robust ethical framework. And within this robust ethical framework, I think there's a way going forward where we can do this ethically. But there's actually a lot of opportunities for this to solve big world problems. So one thing is the climate change. And there, I'll just use, sort of climate change is a really big problem. We don't really know how to solve it. But it turns out that we can use human engineering to help us address climate change.
Okay, here's a tip. Anyone who uses the phrase robust ethical framework wouldn't know ethics if they got in the shower with him. And you know that for a fact because he uses the phrase human engineering. Human engineering? The name alone should make you pause and take a deep breath. People are not bridge buttons. You can't just add rebar, pour a few yards of concrete, and improve the human condition, much less the human soul. People are living beings. They're alive. They can't be engineered. Lau, the eminent bioethicist, seems unaware of this. So he outlined some of his proposals in a recent paper in the Journal of Ethics, Policy, and Environment. In that paper, Lau suggests a solution to the pressing problem of people eating hamburgers. People like hamburgers, it turns out. How can we get them to stop eating hamburgers? Well, not by convincing them that hamburgers are bad. That was the old way. That's how democracy worked. You would tell people something. If they believed you, they did it. If they didn't, they didn't. Because it was their country. It was their government. It was self-government. But it turns out that's too time-consuming. The new model is we just use pharmaceuticals to make people comply. If your kids are getting uppity, dope them out, and they'll obey. And Lau proposes a nationwide system like that, a pill that would make people nauseous at the sight of red meat. Now, given that climate change is an existential threat that is limiting our time on Earth to 20 years or 12 years or 6 months, or pick your exaggeration, it's pretty hard to believe a pill like that would be optional. It would be mandatory pretty soon. Does that sound like a dystopian fantasy? Oh, it's not, because Lau is deadly serious. Watch him explain at the World Science Festival.
So here's the thought, right? So it turns out that we know a lot about, we have these intolerance to, for example, I have milk intolerance. And some people are intolerant to crayfish. So possibly we can use human engineering to make it the case that we're intolerant to certain kinds of meat, to certain kinds of bovine protein. So that's something that we can do through human engineering. We can kind of possibly address really big world problems through human engineering.
Human engineering. Why do we laugh at Alex Jones again? Sincere question. But again, says the bioethicist, human engineering is the answer. But wait a second, you ask. Human engineering? That's kind of creepy. Didn't we try this kind of thing in Europe 80 years ago? And at the time, didn't we agree we're not going to do that ever again? True. But bioethicists have short memories. In any case, climate change is a pressing emergency, so we don't have time to consider the consequences of our response to this existential crisis. So here's an idea, says Lau at the World Science Festival. Let's fiddle with the human genome to see if we can make human children smaller than they are now. A race of dwarfs. They would eat less, and they'd be cheaper to transport.
to transport larger people rather than smaller people, right? But if we're smaller, just by 15 centimeters, right? That's a mass. I did the math, and it's about mass reduction of 25%, which is huge. And 100 years ago, we were all on the average smaller, exactly about 15 centimeters smaller, right? So think of just the, like lifetime greenhouse gas emissions if we had smaller children, right? And so that's something that we could do.
Imagine if we had smaller children, little tiny children. Think of how little they would emit in greenhouse gases. Think about how easy it would be to pick them up, juggle them around, control them. All we need to do is experiment on human children, and we can solve climate change. That was at a public conference 5 years ago. Nobody said anything. That's where we are. Surprised? You shouldn't be surprised. In fact, what you just heard is less ghoulish than some of the things happening in labs right now. This is what science looks like when it's been completely decoupled from wisdom and from decency and from Christianity. It is a science fiction novel come to life, except it's real.